Welcome to Publishing at NOAA Week. We have been sending out an email a day from the library and hopefully giving you all lots of good information about publishing at NOAA. So today we have the open access monster, busting myths and misconceptions around open access. Today's presenter is Jenn for Fagan-Fry, who is the NOAA Institutional Repository Manager and Scholarly Communications Librarian here in the NOAA Central Library. Jenn, I'm going to let you take it away.
Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's having a good afternoon I think everybody should be afternoon by now. So today we are going to talk a little bit more and go a little more in depth about open access. We get a ton of questions about open access and some of the nuances. So I thought it would be really beneficial to sort of go into some of these misconceptions and frankly, they are myths about open access publishing, the differences between certain types of open access and such. So because we have a lot to go through, I'm just going to dive right into things. So our first myth that we're going to cover, open access and public access are the same thing. This is absolutely false. They are different, and there are some sort of nuances, but some pretty big differences between them. So let's compare the two, right? Public access is something that applies to federal employees and those funded by federal agencies, our grantees, our contractors, our cooperative institutes. Open access can apply to all researchers. Anyone, whether they're funded by the federal government or not, are able to participate in open access models. Public access can include all types of research, data, software, you name it. Generally, when we're talking about open access, most commonly folks are referring to publications. Sometimes you will hear folks refer to open access in terms of data and software, but it's a little bit different. So it's not always the same thing. When you hear open access, typically people are referring to publications. Public access, and this is where the big difference sort of comes into play, is talking about the free, immediate, and persistent ability to access, obtain, view, download, so on and so forth, the results of federally funded research. Open access is just when those research outputs, specifically journal articles, are distributed online and they are free of charge for folks to access. There's no barrier in terms of people being able to get at those and read those and download those articles. When we talk about public access, we're talking about ensuring that the public can find and download and analyze, reuse. Reuse is a key piece here, all of that information. And also, I'm going to stay on the public access side for a second. A lot of this is derived, public access is derived from the White House OSTP memos. So the one in 2013, the Holdren memo, and the new from last year, the 2022 memo, the Nelson memo, as well as other agency sorts of requirements, right? When we're talking about open access can, and most commonly does, have a fee associated with it. It doesn't always, and we'll get into that in a second, but typically this fee, though, is transferred not from the reader, but to the author. The author is the one, or in some instances, the funder is the one who covers those fees. So they are not one and the same. There are some differences. Can open access be a part and a pathway to public access? Absolutely. But are they the same thing? No. So I have a couple 0.5 myths throughout these. So these are things that are tied to sort of the main myth that we're going over. And this one is free access. We've talked about this before. Free access on a publisher site is the same thing as open access, and this is false. Free access, or sometimes you'll see full access, is not the same thing as open access. When we're talking about free and full access, what a publisher is saying is that you are able to view that article, but on their website only. You can only read it right there from the website. If you try to download that PDF, if you don't have a subscription, you won't be able to. You are free to read the article, but you cannot download or reuse that content. So I have a couple examples here. One that says free access, one that says full access. Typically, you will see free and full access in things like hybrid journals, which we'll talk about those in a few minutes. But free access or full access is not the same thing as open access. So myth number 2, you have to pay an article processing charge, or APC, to publish open access. So this is one of the few myths I have in here that isn't necessarily a true or false. It's sort of a false. It's partially a false, and here's why. There's sort of different flavors of open access. So I'm going to go over the 3 major ones. There's 2 other ones that get very in the weeds and aren't necessarily applicable to what we're talking about here today. So there's 3 main flavors of open access. The first being diamond open access. This is where you the articles within a publication are made open for reading. You can download them, you can share them, you can post them, you can remix, reuse, whatever it is, via the publisher site at no cost to either the author or the reader. So you wouldn't have to have a subscription to that journal, and as an author, you don't have to pay to publish in that journal. A great example of this is our very own fishery bulletin through the National Marine Fisheries Service. This is what's considered a diamond open access journal. Another example is chemical science. So these are just 2 examples of diamond open access journals where there is no fee associated for authors or readers. Gold open access. This is the one most folks think about when we're talking about open access. This is that full, immediate access to the publisher's version of that article. You do not have to have a subscription. Anyone can go to that publisher's website and access and download that article. However, with gold open access, the author is the one footing the bill for that. The author is charged that article processing charge. So an example of a gold open access journal would be Frontiers in Marine Science, which is something a number of our offices publish within. And then the other major one is what's called green open access. We've talked a lot about this, which is self-archiving. And what you're archiving is the post-reviewed pre-publication manuscript. Typically, you're going to deposit this within a repository, such as the NOAA IR. That manuscript version would be made freely to folks through that repository. However, to access the publisher's version, you would still have to have a subscription to that journal, right? So there's a number of examples where this would be applicable, but one that I have here is atmospheric research. So these are sort of the main 3 types or flavors of open access that we discuss. So hybrid journals, and this is where that green open access comes into play. A hybrid journal is a journal that has a mix of open access articles and those that you can only access via a subscription. So that's where it's a mixture of that gold open access and a subscription base, right? So the open access articles are gold, where the authors or the funders have paid to make those articles open access, and the rest would require a subscription. So some examples, and these are all journals that the NOAA library subscribes to. So you at work have access to these journals because the library is paying for the subscription access to these. So Journal of Geophysical Research, Nature is the big one that everyone is familiar with. Journal of Great Lakes Research, Applied Meteorology and Climatology through AMS. These are all things that are considered hybrid journals where you could pay for open access, the gold route, or you could not. So that's sort of what a hybrid journal is. It's a hybrid of paying for open access and paying subscriptions to access the rest of the content. So myth number 3, and this one, we actually get this a lot. Open access articles are not copyrighted. False. That's 100% false. And what I want to talk about here is sort of the idea of copyright and licensing. They're 2 very different things. They talk to each other. You can't have one without the other. But I think it's important to know that when it comes to an open access article, there's still copyright. there's a copyright statement on every single open access article. It's just a matter of, when it comes to open access, who owns that copyright, who holds the copyright. So what I want to do here is sort of talk about the differences between copyright and the license that's attached to it. So when it comes to copyright, this is who owns that intellectual property, and it exists from the moment that that content is created. So the moment you think of something and write it down, that is copyrighted material. You own the copyright to it. It is granted to the creator unless you, as the creator and the sort of inherent owner of that copyright, assign it to someone else. Typically, this is done through what's called a CTA, or a copyright transfer agreement. So in the case of a journal article, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these. That's something you sign with the publisher, giving them, essentially transferring the copyright to them, right? So for open access articles, typically, I'm going to say typically because there are a few very rare instances where this may not be the case, but typically the author and or their contributors retain the copyright. I'm going to sidestep licensing for one quick second and throw this out there because I know this is a question people are already asking in their minds and possibly even typing right now. As federal employees, if we are creating something as a federal employee, as part of the scope of our work and on government time, we cannot copyright anything. We have no copyright to give. We have no copyright to transfer as a federal employee. And I have a note about this under here, right? There is no effective transfer of copyright for U.S. government works because they're not eligible under the U.S. copyright law to be copyrighted. So just a side note there. Licensing. Every journal article, whether it's open access or not, has some sort of license attached to it, right? Licensing grants permissions to use that content, whether it's text, data, whatever the content is. A license is going to grant the user and or reader permission. Typically, the license is chosen by the copyright holder, whether that's you or if you've transferred your copyright to a publisher, the publisher. Licenses are, in theory, enforceable in perpetuity, unless the copyright owner alters the license, which they are permitted to do. So when we're talking about open access articles, usually the author or the publisher, in some instances, if you've transferred that copyright, will choose what's called a Creative Commons license, and we'll go into that in just one second. So, side note here about licenses for those of you that are not federal employees, so our contract colleagues or our cooperative institute or grantee colleagues. Within either your employer's contract with NOAA or within your grant or funding terms and conditions, there may be language that specifies the type of copyright and or license that you should be using or implementing. You would need to check within those grant terms and conditions or with your employer to see how those things may apply. So I mentioned Creative Commons licenses, so I wanted to go into sort of the basics of what those are. And there's a couple main types here, right? There's 5 main types of Creative Commons licenses. How I have them listed here are from the most permissive and open down to the least open. CC0 is essentially a public domain license. Government works are in the public domain in the United States, right? At the very bottom, we have what's called a CC by NCND. So this is a Creative Commons license that restricts commercial use and does not permit adaptations or derivatives. So non-commercial, non-derivative license. So this is sort of the most restrictive in terms of permissions for folks when it comes to using the content within the held within that article, right? So This question we get all the time related to folks will have their copyright transfer agreement and they're trying to choose which license. What license should I choose? Oftentimes, publishers are going to ask you to choose between sort of a selection of licenses. I'll say this now, there is no formal NOAA policy to date as to what folks are to choose, whether they're a federal employee or a contractor funded person. And personally, as a librarian, there's a few recommendations that we would have, but again, ultimately, the choice is up to you and or your contributors and co-authors. Within the library, our recommendation is to select the most open license available to you. Typically, the publishers are going to offer you a CC BY, which is very, very open, or a CC BY NCND. That's that most restrictive one that we were looking at. Typically, we're going to recommend in this instance to go with the CC BY. As a government entity and in the interest of things like public access and making all of our information, data, content available to the widest range of people possible, we don't want to put any sort of restrictions on it, even commercial entities. We should still be making all of that as open as we can. So typically when folks ask me this question, which license should I choose? I personally would recommend going with the most open, which would be that CC BY. Quick side note, because this is also sort of a tangent question that comes up when we talk about licenses. With a CC BY, that does still require folks to attribute the original work. So if you're concerned about attribution, and that's why you're thinking you want one of the more restrictive licenses, even with the CC BY, folks are still required to acknowledge and attribute the original work to the author. So you will still get your attribution with a CC BY license. Quick extra, like, what are we on? 2.5.1 notes. So myth number 4, you have to publish open access to meet government public access policies and mandates. I get this question constantly, and I have heard this from a number of folks, especially in light of the Nelson memo back in August, the newest OSTP public access memo. This is false, 100% false. A lot of this comes down to a matter of what a publisher is saying to folks versus what the actual requirements are. And I have publisher wants on here. That might be a little bit of a strong term, but I thought I thought it was sort of indicative of a publisher obviously wants you to and you know guides folks one way that may or may not coincide with what a funder is actually requiring. So publishers want you to publish open access. They get money that way, right? That's their preference. That's not necessarily the government's preference. So for NOAA, again, just speaking through a NOAA lens, NOAA's public access plan, our current public access plan, and our revised one will still mirror this, is what we call business model neutral. We have no preference between green or gold open access. You are welcome to do either route. We welcome both of them. OSTP and NOAA tend to emphasize green. Just with our language, we refer more commonly to those post-review pre-publication manuscripts, which that's the green open access model and business model, excuse me, but you are welcome to publish in a gold vein if you would like to. You get to decide if you want to do something in that open access, that gold open access vein, or if you would rather self-archive. You as the author, and again with your co-authors and contributors, get to make that decision. You do not have to publish open access. You're welcome to, but you could also go the green route in order to still comply with NOAA's public access mandate. Myth 4.5. This is tied very closely with that whole you have to publish open access sort of thinking. Public access mandates infringe on researcher freedom because they require you to publish open access. So as I just said, no, you don't. You are not required to publish open access. Again, see my previous my previous couple slides, right? You don't have to do that. What the public access mandate requires is that you make a version of your content available for public access. That could be that green model. So you don't have to publish in a gold open access journal. You can, you're welcome to, but you don't have to. Sort of the thinking behind how these mandates infringe on, scientific freedom is that, well, if I have to publish open access, only certain journals offer that option. So now it takes away a bunch of the journals that I can publish in. We do not make that requirement. So therefore, all of those journal options are still available to you. There are things that we, again, from a library perspective and a the repository and public access sort of lens, there's a few things that we would recommend folks consider when they're thinking about where to publish, but whether it's gold or whether it's, an open access journal or a closed access journal shouldn't necessarily factor into it. It could be one element of your decision, but it shouldn't be the end all be all, right? So a couple things to consider. Is that journal the best for your work? Is Frontiers in Marine Science the best place? Maybe. Then by all means, you can pay that fee and publish in that gold journal. Is there another option where maybe you wouldn't have to pay the fee, where it would be closed access, but you could give us a copy of the manuscript? Then by all means, do that. That one's essentially, you can't see my air quotes, but free. I would say go that route. Save yourself the money. That's more money you can put into research, right? If your journal is that Frontiers of Marine Science, it's gold, you would have to pay the fee. So, something to keep in mind. Do you have the funds to pay that APC, that fee for gold open access? If yes, great, that helps out. If not, that's okay. You can still archive that manuscript and it still satisfies the public access requirements. You don't have to pay that fee to meet your public access requirements. Also, again, I've said this a few times, it should be a conversation between you and your co-authors and contributors. If all of you are federal employees, there's a real easy way to do that. But if not, if there's a mix of, federal employees, contract employees, folks outside of the government completely, it's a discussion for all of you to have to determine what's the best method forward. And when in doubt, please feel free to contact us. We are always here to help. We're happy to talk about options, look at options with you. Again, we can't tell you where or where not to publish, but we're happy to help you sort of explore the options, check and make sure the journal you're looking at isn't predatory. We have a lot of tools and resources that we're happy to share with you and teach you how to use in order to make the right decision for where your article winds up going. So I've linked here a couple additional resources. We do have our Publishing and Scholarly Communications Guide. We have a lot of information on there about copyright, open access. We have some more information about article processing charges, APCs. There's a ton of great stuff on there. I've also linked here to Creative Commons and their page that goes into real detail about the different types of those Creative Commons licenses and sort of provides a breakdown of the differences between each of them. And then I've also linked here to Sendy's Copyright Task Group, and they have a really great document that is some copyright FAQs. I reference them regularly. They're fantastic when it comes to federal employees and sort of what we can't do, what we should think about when we're talking about copyright, and what may or may not apply to the works that we produce as federal employees. Just a side note, Sendy is like a federal scientific and technical information managers group, and they do a lot of work with copyright across multiple different research outputs. So with that, I think I have 5 minutes. So Katie, I don't know if we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions in that 5 minutes. I'm happy to take them. I tried to go as fast as I could to leave a little bit of time.
That's totally fine. We do have one question so far, so people keep them coming. Put your questions in the chat or in the question panel, sorry. So first question is, many junior staff experience tremendous pressure to publish and lack the experience to identify predatory publishers. Does NOAA Central Library maintain a list of predatory journals?
Great question. We don't necessarily have a list. However, we do have a tool called, is it Cabels or Cobbles? I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, but we have a tool. I'm going to go with Cobbles that you can use to sort of determine if something is predatory. What it does is it looks at all journals and sort of ranks them and flags certain pieces of them that could be potentially predatory practices or behaviors. It's free to use. The library provides that to NOAA for everyone to use. When in doubt, though, again, please contact us. We don't keep like a list of good publishers versus bad publishers, just because it's a bit tricky to do that. And sometimes things are in flux, right? There have been publishers in the past who were labeled as predatory who have turned things around, and they are quite reputable now. So when in doubt, please feel free to reach out to us. But we do have access to some tools that folks can use to check in on predatory practices within existing journals, and that would be Cobbles.
I've also added that link to the chat for everyone to explore. You may have to be on VPN or at your workstation to get access, because I believe it's going to judge if you're with NOAA depending on your IP.
Right. That is a subscription-based service that the library provides to NOAA. So you would need to be on your VPN or plugged into a NOAA network.
Okay, next question. Does a quick lookup table exist for types of publishing options by journal or publisher?
Oh, that is a great question, and not to my knowledge.
It would
However,
be really nice.
it would be really nice. It would be difficult, I think, to have something like that. I think maybe it's something we could look into, sort of creating like a quick and dirty version. It's tricky just because so many publishers have a huge range of titles. And because NOAA has such a wide sort of subject area that we cover, it'd be a little difficult, but I think this is a really interesting question and something I'd like to kind of look at a little bit more. So I'm going to say no right now, but I want to look at this a little more as something maybe we could help folks with.
Okay, last question, Jen. Should we or the authors be getting accepted manuscripts to you all the time, or just when the journal is not open access?
So excellent question. And I tend to tell folks to default to always send me a manuscript. I will always be able to use your manuscript. I may not always be able to use that publisher's version. So if you send a manuscript to us, you're good. You're golden. You are compliant with NOAA policies. I think that's the best default. Always send a manuscript. If we can use the publisher's version, we'll get that, but we'll still archive your manuscript version for you. Great question.